Tonight, before the water grows dark and the stars sharpen above the Atlantic, it is worth beginning with a quieter question. What does it feel like to move through the world with such complete confidence that you never trouble yourself with another ending? What does it feel like to board a ship already praised in newspapers and admired in dockyard, to walk its corridors under electric light, and to believe that the journey ahead will be long only in distance, never in danger? The story of Titanic is often told as a disaster story, and of course it is one. But the part that lingers most gently, and perhaps most strangely, is that the catastrophe did not first arrive as noise. It arrived inside comfort. It arrived inside polished wood, warm dining rooms, steady engines, and the soft routines of people who assumed that modern life had already learned how to protect them. That is why this voyage feels so haunting, even now. The ship was not crossing into a world of obvious storms or visible chaos. She was crossing into a mood of certainty. Almost everyone connected to her believed, in one form or another, that the systems around them were strong enough, experienced enough, modern enough, to keep the old dangers at a distance. The Atlantic remained immense, cold, and indifferent, but human beings had begun to treat it less as a threatening wilderness and more as a timetable. So tonight, rather than rushing toward the iceberg, as if the ending were the only part that mattered, we can drift more slowly into the world that made such an ending possible. We can notice the age that built the ship, the habits that gave people comfort, the details that made the voyage feel almost domestic. We can move through the calm first, because that calm was real. It was not foolish in the simple sense. It was earned by decades of successful crossings, by engineering advances, by routines repeated so often that risk itself seemed to grow faint around the edges. And perhaps that is the quietest truth inside this story. The Great Break did not happen in a world that expected to break. It happened in a world that had become used to being right about itself. For a little while longer, everything would still seem settled. The lights would still glow, orders would still be given in even voices. The sea would still appear merely dark, not hostile. And to understand why that mattered, we have to begin not with the collision, but with the age that believed it had mastered interruption. In the early months of 1912, much of Europe lived inside a mood that was neither ecstatic nor reckless, but composed. It was an age that trusted systems. Railways ran to printed schedules. Steamships kept routes that could be charted months in advance. Businesses communicated across continents with increasing speed. Cities glowed after sunset. Empires, for all their strains and injustices, still projected permanence. It was possible, especially for those who benefited from the arrangement of the world, to imagine that progress had become a stable condition rather than a fragile achievement. This was the late Edwardian atmosphere into which Titanic entered service. The word modern did not yet carry the nervous, restless flavor it would later acquire. It suggested steadiness, order, and a future unfolding in predictable increments. Technical improvements were not thought of as dazzling interruptions to life, so much as confirmations that life was becoming more organized. Crossing the Atlantic had once demanded a measure of surrender to weather, delay, and discomfort. By 1912, for many travelers, it had been transformed into a managed passage between two busy centers of the same commercial world. That transformation mattered. When a society grows used to reliable systems, danger does not disappear, but it becomes easier to treat it as residual, old-fashioned, something already accounted for. The sea was still cold. Ice still drifted south in spring. Machinery could still fail. Yet these possibilities felt increasingly like problems to be handled by specialists, rather than uncertainties to be carried in the imagination of ordinary passengers. A captain would know, an officer would judge, engineers would maintain pressure and power, wireless operators would receive reports, The modern world was full of roles, and roles were reassuring. There was also a social rhythm to this confidence. Wealthy passengers expected service and privacy, not ordeal. Professionals expected efficiency. Migrants expected passage that, while modest, would still be cleaner and more structured than older voyages had been. A crossing was not supposed to feel mythic. It was supposed to feel competent. The heroic age of sea travel seemed to be receding into memory, replaced by something almost administrative. That is what makes the early mood of Titanic so important. She did not appear in an age fascinated by peril. She appeared in an age that believed peril could be distributed across procedures, institutions, and design. The Atlantic had not changed at all, but the human expectation of it had changed profoundly. And from that expectation came the desire for a ship that would not merely cross the ocean, but express an entire civilization's belief in comfort, prestige, and control. Titanic was born from competition, but not from haste. On the North Atlantic, steamship companies did not simply transport people. They staged arguments about what modern travel ought to be. Some ships chased records, some advertised speed as a kind of national character. White Star chose a different kind of grandeur. Rather than trying to outrun every rival on the water, the company decided to create liners that would feel larger, steadier, and more luxurious than almost anything else afloat. If speed won headlines, scale and comfort could win loyalty. That choice led to the Olympic-class ships, and Titanic emerged as one of their clearest statements. She was never intended to be a wild experiment. She was meant to feel like refinement made visible. Her purpose was commercial, of course, but it was also symbolic. She would carry mail, businessmen, families, emigrants, and society figures across the Atlantic. At the same time, she would reassure all of them that they were traveling through the most advanced arrangements of their era. The ship was part service, part advertisement, part floating proof that the modern world could make bigness feel graceful. In Belfast, at Harland and Wolff, that idea took shape through efforts so methodical that it was almost anonymous. Thousands of workers contributed small parts of the whole. Riveters, platers, electricians, carpenters, engineers, fitters, and laborers each handled a fraction of the vision. The ship rose gradually, not in one burst of inspiration, but in coordinated stages that made size feel procedural. Even her immensity came into existence through repetition. Plate after plate, compartment after compartment, deck above deck. By the time she neared completion, the meaning attached to Titanic had grown well beyond her hull. She represented White Star's answer to a wider question. What if the safest-looking form of travel was also the most prestigious? What if a ship could make the ocean feel secondary to the interiors carried across it? The company understood something important about affluent passengers. Many of them did not want to feel adventurous. They wanted to feel well looked after. They wanted to glide through a demanding environment without having to think about the environment too much at all. Even for those not traveling first class, that larger promise still mattered. A new liner suggested order. It suggested cleanliness, structure, a route joining old life to new life. For immigrants, this might mean the first leg of reinvention. For professionals, it meant respectable passage. For corporate leadership, it meant prestige wrapped in steel. Titanic was built to do practical work, but also to carry the softer assurance that large systems, properly funded and properly managed, could make uncertainty feel almost obsolete. The more closely people considered Titanic's design, the easier it was to understand why confidence gathered around her. She was immense in obvious ways, but it was the less visible systems that created the deeper impression. Compartments divided the hull. Bulkheads promised controlled flooding should trouble come. Massive engines and boilers translated coal and labor into smooth forward motion. Electric power lit passageways and cabins with a steadiness that made the old image of storm lanterns and dim passage at sea feel distant. Everything suggested that risk had been anticipated, measured, and assigned its place. Yet the ship's persuasive power came from more than engineering. Luxury itself was part of the illusion of control. Wide staircases, richly paneled rooms, quiet lounges, polished brass, upholstered furniture, and carefully arranged dining spaces all conspired toward one emotional effect. They encouraged passengers to forget that they were on an exposed vessel crossing cold water. A successful hotel never asks its guests to think too much about plumbing, heating, or supply chains. Titanic achieved something similar. Her elegance made complex systems feel natural, and natural things are seldom questioned. This was especially true in first class, where the ship seemed to promise continuity between land and sea. One could dine, read, write letters, stroll, converse, and retire without being constantly reminded of waves or weather. The ocean existed beyond windows and railings, but the life of the ship was designed to dominate attention. Second-class spaces, though simpler, offered an impressively respectable version of the same logic. Even third class, while far plainer, reflected modern standards of order, cleanliness, and regulated movement that were far preferable to many older emigrant voyages. Across the vessel, design reinforced hierarchy, but it also reinforced reassurance. The language later attached to Titanic often exaggerated or simplified these realities. She was not literally believed to be invulnerable by every informed person aboard, but she was widely treated as highly resilient, exceptionally safe, and representative of the best thinking of the day. That distinction matters. People need not believe in perfection to grow careless around precedent. If a system appears to absorb past problems successfully, confidence expands almost on its own. That was the deeper illusion hidden inside all of this careful construction. Complexity can look like mastery. More compartments, more machinery, more procedures, more trained specialists, more redundancy. Each of these things genuinely improves control, but each also tempts the mind toward overconfidence. Titanic was not a foolish ship, and that is precisely why she became such a powerful symbol later. She was built carefully. She was admired for reasons that made sense. She looked like the kind of machine in which older maritime anxieties had finally been civilized into quiet background concerns. A ship of such scale depended on people who trusted the arrangement around them. At the top stood Captain Edward Smith, a man whose authority was rooted less in theatrical command than in accumulated steadiness. He had spent years at sea and carried with him the kind of reputation passengers found reassuring. He was not a figure meant to excite. He was a figure meant to calm. For a company like White Star, that mattered. An ocean liner selling security and refinement benefited from a captain whose very presence suggested that nothing unusual would be required. Below Smith, the officers sustained a watch system shaped by repetition. One man judged the course, another enforced procedure, another handled the rhythms of navigation and duty. They had personalities, certainly, and those personalities would matter later, but before the crisis they functioned mainly as parts of a practiced whole. Their work did not call for drama. It called for alertness inside routine. On most crossings, that was enough. Far below the bridge, the engineers and firemen lived in a different sensory world. Heat, pressure, metal, soot, gauges, and endless shoveling governed their days and nights. If the upper decks were designed to feel serene, the lower decks earned that serenity through labor. Coal had to move. Boilers had to remain fed. Engines had to keep their measured turning. The most visible calm on the ship depended on the least visible exertion. These men did not appear in passenger memories as often as the grand staircase, or the dining saloon. Yet the feeling of stability aboard Titanic was built upon their endurance. Then there was the service staff, stewards, waiters, cleaners, cooks, attendants, and others whose task was to make a complicated environment feel smooth. Good service has a disappearing quality when it succeeds. Passengers hardly notice the number of hands required. Beds are made, meals appear, corridors remain tidy. Questions are answered before they become annoyances. Titanic relied heavily on this unobtrusive competence. The floating world worked because most of its machinery, human and mechanical alike, was not supposed to demand attention. Wireless operators belonged to another emerging category of maritime specialists. Their room linked the ship to shores and other vessels through a technology still new enough to feel modern, yet familiar enough to be heavily used. They passed along passenger messages, received reports, and managed a constant stream of coded traffic. Wireless reduced isolation, but it also created a subtle misconception. The illusion that connected ships were almost continuously protected by information. In truth, information still had to be sorted, prioritized, and interpreted by human beings working within imperfect routines. What bound all these people together was not arrogance so much as procedural faith. Everyone aboard knew a piece of the ship, a piece of the voyage, a piece of the normal way things were done. And because normal crossings usually ended normally, the whole structure of labor and authority encouraged confidence rather than doubt. The ship felt professionally inhabited, and professionally inhabited places tend to feel safe long before they have actually been tested. Passengers brought their own expectations aboard, and those expectations were shaped by class long before the ship left Southampton. Titanic was not a single social experience. She was several experiences arranged one above another, connected by steel and steam, but separated by architecture, custom, and assumption. A person could move through the same voyage while inhabiting a very different emotional world, depending on the ticket held in hand. For the first-class traveler, the ship offered continuation rather than disruption. Private cabins and suites, attentive service, long meals, and well-appointed public rooms made the voyage feel like a moving extension of hotel life. One did not board such a ship expecting hardship. One expected privacy, comfort, and the gentle novelty of changing company at dinner, or seeing the ocean framed by polished interiors. Even the act of walking the deck had a social quality. It was not simply exercise. It was part of being seen, and of seeing others within a carefully controlled environment. Second class presented a more restrained version of the same promise. There was less grandeur, but there was solid dignity. Teachers, clergy, engineers, merchants, writers, and families of moderate means could feel that they were traveling well. The spaces were respectable, the food ample, the surroundings modern. For many, it represented not extravagance, but good sense. The ship was proof that decency and order had reached levels once reserved for the very wealthy. Third class carried still another emotional charge. Many passengers in these quarters were not travelers in the leisurely sense at all. They were migrants, or people moving toward work, reunion, or possibility. They came with different languages, different bundles of belongings, and hopes large enough to make discomfort seem tolerable. Even so, Titanic offered them a voyage better regulated and better ventilated than older passages had often been. The crossing was a means, not the destination, but the ship still mattered because she stood at the threshold between one life and another. All this separation was visible everywhere. Corridors guided movement, public rooms were designated, doors, staircases, and rules preserved distance between groups. To a modern eye, this can appear harsh, yet aboard Titanic, it also contributed to predictability. People generally remained where they expected to remain. The vessel felt organized because the social world on it was organized. Order reduced friction, and reduced friction feels a great deal like safety. That, too, would matter later in ordinary time. Class division helped the ship run smoothly. It gave passengers clear expectations and staff clear responsibilities. But smoothness can hide cost. A system built to keep worlds separate in normal conditions may not adapt gracefully when urgency suddenly asks those worlds to collide. For now, though, nothing seemed strained. Each group settled into its own version of the voyage, and the ship, carrying many futures at once, felt calm precisely because it seemed to have a place ready for everyone. Southampton on the morning of departure was busy in the manner of places accustomed to departures. Trains arrived, luggage rolled, officials checked lists, workers moved with practiced efficiency, and the ship herself towered above the dock with the quiet authority of a completed task. For those living in the port city, large liners were impressive but not mystical. They belonged to the scenery of labor. Titanic drew attention. Certainly, but she did not suspend ordinary life around her. That may be the most striking thing to remember. History often begins while everyone nearby is still doing routine work. Passengers boarded in waves according to circumstance. Those in first class arrived with porters and trunks, absorbed into the vessel with very little visible strain. Second-class travelers came more briskly, attentive to signs and practical details. Third-class passengers often arrived earlier and passed through inspections shaped by immigration rules and bureaucratic caution. The atmosphere differed slightly among them, yet the larger tone was shared. This was a beginning, not a trial. People adjusted luggage, found cabins, met staff, and oriented themselves to corridors and decks. The ship changed from an admired object into an inhabited environment. The crew underwent a similar transition. Officers verified orders, stewards learned cabin assignments, engineers checked systems. The immense structure had to become a functioning organism by noon, and it did. Mail was loaded in volume. Coal had already been taken aboard over days of dirty labor. Behind the graceful impression of departure sat a vast amount of preparation, much of it invisible once the first passengers began exploring public rooms or looking down toward the dock. When the ship finally cast off, there came that brief disturbance involving the nearby liner New York, pulled dangerously by the suction of Titanic's movement. For a moment, attention sharpened, lines strained, tugs reacted, engines stopped. It is tempting, from a great historical distance, to treat this almost collision as an omen, but to those present it was something more mundane, an operational complication in a crowded harbor. The important thing is not that it happened. The important thing is how quickly the mood resumed its equilibrium once danger had passed. That quick return to normality says much about the mental world aboard Titanic. Problems, when they appeared, were expected to be handled by the people tasked with handling them. And this one had been. The ship went on. The river carried her outward. The whistle sounded with measured depth. Shore receded. Lunches would still be served. Cabins still had to be unpacked. New acquaintances would still be made. The voyage did not feel shadowed. It felt launched. By the time Southampton began to fall behind, the emotional shape of the crossing had already been established. Titanic was not entering the Atlantic as an uncertain venture. She was entering it as a large, well-managed continuation of everything the company had promised, and everything the age found plausible. The stops that followed at Cherbourg and Queenstown did not interrupt the voyage so much as complete it. At Cherbourg, tenders moved between shore and ship because the harbor could not receive so vast a liner directly. Additional passengers came aboard, among them some whose names would later draw attention, because wealth and prominence have a way of remaining visible in records. Yet at the time, this was simply part of a transatlantic route. Mail changed hands, luggage was moved, cabins were filled. Social patterns adjusted themselves almost immediately. By the time Titanic touched at Queenstown, on the Irish coast, the emotional geography of the voyage had shifted further. More third-class passengers boarded there, many carrying the concentrated expectation of departure that belongs to people leaving not merely one place, but perhaps one life. Families clustered close, bundles and cases were held carefully. Final glances toward shore carried a weight different from the casual deck walking of more seasoned travelers. And still, even here, fear of the ship itself remained absent. The vessel represented distance, yes, but also possibility. When Titanic left Ireland behind, land no longer formed part of the immediate story. The coast receded. The ship turned more fully into the Atlantic. This was the quiet threshold. There was no dramatic line painted across the sea to mark the transition from near water to open ocean. Instead, the horizon simply widened until it seemed to absorb all reference. That widening had its own lullaby. Movement became continuous. The ship no longer paused for tendering or harbor procedure. She settled into the long logic of crossing, on board. This had a calming effect. Stops can make a voyage feel provisional. Once the final port falls astern, the journey becomes singular. Meals and sleep begin to organize themselves around ship time rather than land time. People stop thinking of departure and start thinking, more vaguely, of arrival. That in-between state often softens the mind. The world contracts to corridors, decks, weather, and conversation. Titanic was especially suited to this contraction because she gave passengers so many ways to remain occupied without ever demanding strain. There is also something psychologically important about the last sight of land. Once it disappears, people tend to hand over a little more of themselves to routine. The sea asks for that surrender gently at first. You let the crew navigate. You let the clocks be changed. You let the ship determine when you eat, where you walk, when you retire. The vessel becomes the frame of reality. And if the vessel feels secure, then the world within that frame feels secure as well. That was now the condition aboard Titanic. Europe had slipped behind her in stages, almost too softly to notice. Ahead lay open water, cold currents, and all the ordinary assumptions of spring passage. But none of that felt ominous yet. The sea was becoming the entire environment. And because the ship carried its own order so well, that environment still seemed entirely manageable. Once Titanic had cleared the last port and steadied into her westward passage, the voyage entered the long middle region, where daily life becomes quietly repetitive. This was the part many passengers would probably have expected to remember least had nothing gone wrong. Such days at sea were not designed to shock the senses. They were designed to smooth them. Time was broken into meals, walks, letters, reading, naps, light conversation, and the subtle rearrangement of chairs and habits that occurs whenever people settle into a temporary shared world. Morning came softly aboard a large liner. Stewards moved through corridors with discretion, bringing order to cabins that had already begun to acquire the look of occupation. Wash basins were refreshed, beds were adjusted. A knock at the door could mean tea, hot water, news of breakfast hours, or some small service so ordinary that it disappeared from memory as soon as it was completed. In first class especially, the morning belonged to choice. One might rise early and take the deck air, or remain in bed a little longer, with the comfortable sense that the ship would continue smoothly either way. Breakfast itself helped give shape to the day. Tables, cloths, silver, toast, eggs, coffee, fruit, conversation. Even those who felt little need to eat heavily often found that dining aboard a ship had its own quiet pleasure because it marked time without urgency. The ocean outside might be vast, but inside, one course followed another, and the small continuity of service turned abstract distance into domestic sequence. Second class experienced something a little more regulated, yet the same principle applied. In third class, people were free to Meals were livelier and more communal, but they too offered rhythm and reassurance. Between meals came the great soft occupation of ocean travel, passing time without having to justify it. People walked the decks for the sake of movement and air, often tracing the same lines again and again. They wrote letters to be mailed on arrival. They read books not because they were pressed to learn anything in particular, but because reading and the sea form an old alliance. Children adapted to the environment according to the rules around them. Some were supervised gently in broader spaces, others kept closer to family. Everywhere, the ship trained the mind toward repetition. Below decks, of course, the rhythm was harsher. Firemen fed furnaces, trimmers moved coal, engineers watched pressure and motion. Their working day was built from heat, noise, and endurance rather than calm. Yet even here, routine ruled. The engine rooms were not sites of romantic improvisation. They were systems of labor timed as carefully as meals above. The steady pulse, felt in a lounge chair, or heard faintly through a cabin wall, was the human effort of dozens of men, translated into mechanical regularity. The wireless room remained busy as well. Messages came in, messages went out, and the ship preserved the modern illusion of being connected even in mid-ocean. That connection reassured passengers. It also reassured the age itself. If communication could travel invisibly across water, then perhaps isolation had been reduced to a manageable inconvenience. As the days passed, the vessel became more familiar. Its size seemed less astonishing. Corridors grew easier to navigate. Faces became recognizable. The extraordinary had started to feel normal. And when the extraordinary becomes normal, vigilance often grows sleepy around the edges. What made Titanic feel safe was not merely her reputation, but the number of tiny signals that kept confirming that reputation hour after hour. The carpets held their silence beneath passing shoes. The lighting remained warm and dependable. Meals arrived when expected. Doors opened and closed without fuss. A walk from cabin to lounge, from lounge to deck, from deck back to dining room could be completed without encountering any sign of strain or disorder. Safety rarely announces itself directly. More often, it accumulates through the absence of interruption. The ship's soundscape contributed to this immensely. There was vibration, yes, but it was measured and unthreatening. The sort of background steadiness that quickly becomes part of the body rather than an object of attention. At night, lying in a berth, a passenger might feel the faint and regular tremor of forward motion and interpret it not as exposure, but as continuity. The machine was working. The route was being kept. Somewhere above, officers were on watch. Somewhere below, coal was still being fed into furnaces. The whole vessel seemed to go on by itself. Warmth mattered too. Cold is a reminder of environment. Warm interiors are a kind of forgetting. In saloons and cabins, at writing desks and dining tables, passengers could remain insulated from the North Atlantic, even while crossing it. Curtains, paneling, upholstery, polished wood, and attentive service all helped preserve the feeling that one lived within a stable shell through which weather and darkness passed only at a distance. Even those who ventured out onto deck for air could retreat quickly to comfort. Routine also softened social nerves. By the second and third full days at sea, passengers had discovered favorite spots, familiar faces, and preferred patterns of movement. The ship no longer felt like an unknown object requiring interpretation. It felt inhabited and therefore trustworthy. This is one of the quiet moneymakers of sleep content and of long-form historical narration alike. The repeated return to little certainties. A nap after lunch, a cup placed gently on a saucer, a steward recognizing a face, a corridor lit the same way in the evening as it was the night before. Such details tell the nervous system that all is well. This mattered especially because the sea itself remained largely abstract to many aboard. People knew, in a general sense, that the Atlantic could be cold and difficult. but knowledge held in the abstract does not compete very effectively with direct evidence of order. Direct evidence tends to win, and all the direct evidence around Titanic still said the same thing. The ship was strong, the staff were composed, the days were pleasant, if danger existed. It was somewhere outside the lived texture of experience. So the voyage continued under a kind of sensory persuasion. Not loud persuasion, not crude persuasion, but the steady suggestion that this floating world had anticipated its needs and contained its risks. After any small expenditure of energy, a meal or a warm room or a quiet corridor brought the body back to ease. Titanic excelled at returning people to ease. That was one of her deepest strengths. It would also become one of the reasons belief held so long when the first signs of trouble finally arrived. Ice was never absent from North Atlantic thinking in spring. Officers knew the season. Other captains knew it too. Reports moved through wireless networks in fragments, noting bergs here, field ice there, cold air, coordinates, rough positions. The loose cartography of a hazard that drifted rather than stayed politely fixed. Nothing about this was fantastical. Ice belonged to the ocean's old habits. It was part of the inherited grammar of sea travel. And because it was familiar, it often entered decision-making, not as a dramatic threat, but as a condition to be managed. That distinction is important. Human beings react intensely to singular warnings, and much more gently to repeated ones. A lone alarming message can jolt the mind. A series of related messages, each intelligible and ordinary in itself, can dissolve into background. Titanic received information of this latter kind. Reports arrived, were noted, were discussed, were in some cases posted or passed along. They did not all carry the same urgency. They did not all arrive at moments when the wireless room was quiet. They did not combine themselves into one large flashing sign. Information rarely organizes itself that neatly, meanwhile. The ship continued to perform exactly as expected. There were no heavy seas to make caution feel emotionally necessary. No storm battered the hull. No mechanical failure interrupted the schedule. Quite the opposite. The Atlantic was calm, almost too calm. Though this quality did not announce itself as sinister to those enjoying a smooth passage. The colder air creeping into deck walks might be noticed and commented upon. But cold in April did not constitute revelation. It merely confirmed latitude and season on the bridge. Judgment was shaped by precedent. Ships had crossed regions of reported ice before. They had adjusted course where useful, sharpened lookouts, and continued on. The logic of speed itself did not appear reckless in clear conditions. If anything, to some minds it could seem efficient to move through a concerning region without lingering. Such ideas were not invented aboard Titanic. They belonged to a broader maritime culture that trusted seamanship, visibility, and the accumulated habits of successful passage. The difficulty lay in the way several manageable factors began to gather. Ice reports suggested a field extending farther south than usual. The sea's unusual stillness removed the breaking waves that sometimes help reveal ice at night. Temperatures dropped, the sky remained clear and star-filled, but the absence of moonlight darkened the surface itself. Each factor could be folded into routine. Together, they thinned the margin in ways no single person aboard experienced as a decisive change. Passengers, naturally, remained insulated from most of this. Inside the ship, the old pattern continued. Dinner followed lunch. Conversation followed dinner. The vessel remained warmly inhabited. If warnings existed, they existed mostly within technical channels and professional judgment. The emotional life of the ship had not yet absorbed them. And because it had not, the overall mood remained what it had been for days. Settled, intelligent, and only faintly touched by the colder reality spreading through the water ahead. Sunday, April 14th, passed over Titanic with the deceptive softness of a day that appears to have no intention of becoming memorable. Morning came clear and cool. Passengers stepping onto deck noticed the sharper air and perhaps held their coats a little closer around themselves. But the sea remained inviting in its own restrained way, smooth, level, and almost silvery in places under the daylight. Nothing in the visual field suggested alarm. If anything, the calmness of the water lent the ship an extra sense of authority, as if the Atlantic had agreed to cooperate. Meals gave the day its familiar frame. Breakfast arrived in its expected manners across the classes. Some attended religious services, some wrote letters, some drifted from one room to another, passing the hours with the well-fed ease peculiar to shipboard time. In first class, conversation could linger because nothing urgent impeded with it. In second class, the routines of respectable travel continued with satisfying regularity. In third class, families moved through more communal spaces, and the ship, though not luxurious there, still seemed orderly and full of possibility. For many aboard, it was a good day for simply being carried westward. The crew lived the same day from another angle. Watches changed. Instruments were noted. Messages were handled. Food was prepared, served, and cleared. Fires were fed below. The operational side of the ship maintained its quiet machinery of repetition. Nothing in the day's labor would have seemed extraordinary to men used to service and sea. If there was tension anywhere, it was diffused into procedure. Ice reports existed, conditions were noted, yet routine still held the stronger emotional charge. Human beings often continue living according to the most immediate evidence around them, and the immediate evidence still spoke of a ship functioning beautifully. There is a kind of sleepiness that comes not from exhaustion, but from uninterrupted order. Sunday aboard Titanic seems to have had something of that quality. The voyage had lasted long enough for habits to settle. The novelty of the ship no longer demanded constant attention. Even the great interiors had begun to feel inhabitable rather than astonishing. One could move through them with less thought. That is a crucial state in a long historical sleep narrative. The mind is not bored, but it is soothed by pattern. Titanic had entered precisely that soothing pattern. As afternoon passed into evening, lights brightened within while the air outside grew colder. Fewer passengers lingered on deck after dark inside. The contrast between warm rooms and the black ocean beyond windows became sharper. Yet, that contrast often increases comfort rather than fear. The ship felt like shelter. Dinner in first class remained a social occasion. Elsewhere aboard, the evening thinned toward cabins, conversations, and sleep. The wireless room remained busy with messages. Officers on the bridge watched a cold, clear night unfold. No one needed to invent normality. It surrounded them naturally. This may be the deepest sadness of the day. It was not a day spoiled by obvious dread. It was a day almost perfectly shaped to reinforce trust. Sunday ended as Sunday had been lived, in sequence, in quiet confidence, under the assumption that the coming hours would resemble the hours already past. The last full day aboard Titanic did not feel like the edge of anything. It felt like another gentle page in a voyage that had so far given its passengers very little reason to worry. By late evening, the ship moved through a darkness so clear that the stars themselves seemed almost close enough to harden the sky. The sea below reflected very little. Without moonlight and without much wind, it appeared less like a moving surface than a broad black absence. On the bridge and in the crow's nest, watch continued, as watch always did. Eyes forward, course maintained, the practiced labor of searching a horizon that did not readily reveal depth. Then came the interruption, not a thunderous blow, not the sort of collision that throws a sleeping ship into instant terror. First, there was sighting, the sudden realization that a darker shape lay ahead where darkness had seemed undisturbed. Then the order to change course. The helm moved. The great mass of the ship answered, but answered with the delay that belongs to great mass. Titanic began to turn. The iceberg slid along the starboard side, not as a dramatic enemy in plain view, but as a pale, looming presence only partly grasped in the night. For many aboard, what followed scarcely registered. A faint tremor, a scraping sensation, perhaps a small change in the rhythm beneath the feet. Objects shifted slightly in some places. In others, nothing at all seemed to occur. That is part of what makes the event so unsettling. The decisive moment of the voyage arrived with so little theatrical force that belief did not know where to attach itself. A truly violent impact would have forced recognition. This one did not, yet below the surface, where no passenger could watch it, the consequences had already begun. The iceberg did not need to tear a single spectacular wound. It only needed to open enough of the hull, along enough compartments, to begin a process the ship had not been designed to survive. And because that process began below water, invisible to the human eye and largely inaudible to human ears, the emotional lag between cause and understanding widened immediately. The ship came to a stop. Officers assessed. Passengers who noticed anything at all asked quiet questions. Some, curious rather than frightened, later saw bits of ice on deck and found the sight novel. The vessel remained upright, illuminated, and impressively composed. If danger had announced itself only through appearances, almost no one would have believed it serious. Titanic looked whole. She felt whole. That was the eerie power of the moment. Reality had shifted decisively, but perception still lingered in the old world. In historical memory, this is the point where the known story often rushes forward. But aboard the ship, time did not rush yet. It paused. It held its breath. The night after impact was not immediately the night of panic. It was first the night of uncertainty, of professionals gathering facts, of passengers wondering whether the stop was temporary, of a floating city still wearing the face of calm even after the arithmetic of disaster had already begun beneath it. Once the ship had stopped, the crucial work moved downward and inward, away from the sight of passengers and into the colder logic of inspection. Reports began to come from the forward parts of the ship. Water, where water ought not to be, crew members hearing and seeing the unmistakable signs of flooding. Watertight doors were closed as designed. The system answered promptly. That response mattered because it confirmed something that would remain true throughout the disaster. Many parts of Titanic worked exactly as intended. The tragedy would not come from a total absence of systems, but from the way their assumptions met a scale of damage beyond what had been planned. Thomas Andrews moved through the ship with the concentration of a man whose mind had long lived inside its design. He did not need melodrama to understand what he was seeing. He needed compartment counts, water levels, the shape of the bow, the relation between one flooded space and the next. The conclusion he reached was not emotional in origin. It was structural. Too many compartments had been opened to the sea. The bulkheads, sufficient for lesser damage, would not contain flooding once the ship's trim lowered enough for water to spill onward from one section into another. This is where the emotional architecture of the story changes. The ship became lost first in calculation, not in sight. Long before many passengers felt true fear, Andrews understood that Titanic had moved beyond recovery. She would not capsize immediately. She would not vanish in minutes. She would remain outwardly controlled for long enough to confuse the mind. But she would sink. That was now no longer speculation. It was consequence. Captain Smith absorbed that judgment. Under conditions unlike any routine seamanship could comfortably prepare a man to face. A captain of a liner was trained to command through weather, traffic, uncertainty, and occasional emergency. He was not trained through experience to oversee the abandonment of a vast, brightly lit ship that still seemed fundamentally composed. Yet decisions had to begin. Lifeboats must be uncovered. Passengers must be called up. Wireless assistance must be summoned. The work of preparation began, while the emotional meaning of that work was still only partly visible to most aboard. And this is where disbelief becomes one of the central human facts of the night. People respond most quickly when danger looks like danger. Fire, violent motion, darkness, screaming. These can force understanding. Titanic offered almost none of that at first. The engines were silent now, but the lights remained on. The ship was warm. There was no immediate list dramatic enough to panic the body. In first-class cabins and elsewhere, a request to dress warmly and put on a life belt could still sound precautionary rather than final. That gap between professional knowledge and passenger perception shaped everything that followed. Andrews had crossed from uncertainty into grim clarity. The ship's fate had already been decided by water and steel, but for the great majority of human beings aboard, the world still looked inhabitable. And when people are asked to leave a place that still feels secure, hesitation becomes almost inevitable. The uncovering and loading of lifeboats should, in theory, have transformed doubt into action. Yet, theory meets the human mind in complicated ways, especially on a cold, clear night when the thing you are being asked to abandon still seems safer than the thing you are being asked to enter. Titanic's boats hung over the black water as narrow, exposed craft. The ship beneath them was heated, lit, and massive. To step from one into the other required not only obedience, but imagination. You had to believe that the great liner could no longer protect you, even while she still appeared to be doing exactly that. Stewards went through cabins waking passengers. Women and children were told to come up. Life belts were distributed. Questions were asked and answered in tones meant to preserve order. There is often a temptation, from far away, to criticize reassurance as though truth could always be delivered in its rawest form without consequence. But the people supervising Titanic understood something about crowds and shock. They feared panic. They believed calm compliance would save more lives than blunt alarm. The trouble was that calm, in this case, also encouraged delay. On deck, another ambiguity took hold. Women and children first sounded clear until it had to be applied boat by boat, side by side, under varying officers. One officer enforced the principle with hard exclusivity, preferring empty seats to any deviation. Another interpreted it more flexibly, allowing men to board when no women or children were immediately ready. Neither man was inventing chaos. Each was filling an unclarified space in policy with his own judgment. Under ordinary circumstances, experienced judgment is a strength. In a rare catastrophe, differences in judgment can create unequal outcomes with terrible speed. Passengers hesitated for reasons that remain painfully understandable. Husbands did not wish to separate from wives. Wives did not wish to descend into darkness and drift away from what still looked like a stable ship. Some people thought they would soon be called back aboard. Others imagined rescue ships arriving before any true danger matured. The boats seemed too small for certainty, too exposed for comfort. To step down into them felt less like entering safety than surrendering confidence. Class complicated the process further. First-class passengers, by virtue of proximity and information, often reached the boat deck sooner and with fewer obstacles. Second-class passengers encountered more confusion. Third-class passengers, farther away in both geography and authority, faced language barriers, unfamiliar routes, and the sheer delay produced by moving many people through a structured ship not designed for mass upward urgency. Later, retelling sometimes flattened this into one moral image, but the reality was a tangle of procedure, separation, and time. Delay did not always come from one locked gate or one cruel command. Often, it came from the ordinary design of a divided world suddenly asked to behave like a single emergency. Meanwhile, the lowering itself demanded skill. Ropes had to run cleanly. Crews had to know their positions. Boats could not simply be stuffed and dropped. A half-filled boat looks tragic in hindsight, but in the moment, it could result from a dozen pressures operating at once: reluctance to board, uncertainty about time, fear of overcrowding, and the officer's instinct to keep the sequence moving rather than stall. None of this made the shortage less fatal. It only made the human texture of the failure more complicated. Through all this, Titanic continued her deceptive performance of composure. The night remained astonishingly calm. The stars remained hard and clear overhead. The decks were still illuminated. Music would later become part of the memory of these hours, not because it erased reality, but because routine persisted deep into the emergency. That is one of the most haunting truths in the story. The world aboard did not collapse all at once. It persisted in fragments. Manners, procedures, phrases, rules, little returns to order, even as the underlying structure had already been condemned. And so the boats began to leave, some too empty, some not empty at all, each carrying away not just bodies but a degree of belief. Every time one touched the water and pulled back from the hull, the ship appeared a little more strangely immense, a little less self-sufficient, a little more like a world whose confidence was being lowered away in pieces. While passengers assembled and boats moved toward the water, a parallel struggle unfolded in a room most of them would never see. The wireless operators, already tired from the usual burden of passenger traffic, now found themselves translating catastrophe into code. Distress messages went out into the night in repeated bursts. Coordinates were sent, acknowledged, resent. The old emergency signal was used, and the newer one as well. Somewhere beyond the black horizon, other sets heard the calls and turned awareness into reply. There is something peculiarly modern and peculiarly tragic about this part of the story. Titanic was not dying in utter silence. She was speaking. The world beyond her knew, in widening circles, that something was wrong. Yet information and rescue are not the same thing. A message can travel far faster than a ship. Wireless had shrunk isolation, but it had not abolished geography. The nearest vessel capable of meaningful rescue, Carpathia, answered and altered course, but distance still lay between hearing and arriving, between alarm and help. That delay had emotional consequences aboard Titanic. The knowledge that signals had gone out allowed hope to survive in forms both useful and misleading. Help is coming is a stabilizing phrase. It can strengthen discipline. It can also persuade people that the interval before rescue is short enough to justify continued hesitation. Some passengers no doubt thought in exactly those terms. If another ship is on the way, perhaps these boats are temporary. Perhaps this painful separation is brief. Perhaps the liner herself will remain afloat long enough for transfer. Such thoughts do not have to be spoken loudly to shape behavior. They arise naturally whenever assistance is real, but not yet visible. Elsewhere in the wireless world, limitations and misunderstandings multiplied the night's cruelty. Not every ship was close enough. Not every message received the same weight. Some information arrived too late, or went unheard, because systems had not yet matured into continuous watchfulness. This was not the failure of one villainous individual, so much as the failure of a still developing modern network, whose strengths had been oversold by habit. Connected systems feel comprehensive long before they truly are. Aboard Titanic, the operators kept sending until the ship could no longer sustain their work. The room grew more urgent, not because panic burst into it, but because time was steadily narrowing around it. Each signal was both action and admission. To call for aid is to acknowledge limits, yet the very existence of wireless also kept the atmosphere from collapsing entirely into despair. The ship was no longer alone in the old sense. She had reached other ears. She had entered other decisions. This created one of the night's colder returns to safety. Not a warm safety, not the upholstered safety of lounges and electric light, but a procedural safety. A thin line of hope stretched across dark miles of sea. It soothed because it was real. It chilled because it was not enough. Carpathia was coming. Others had heard. The world knew. And still Titanic had to live through the hours before knowing could become touch. By the time many of the boats had left, the ship herself had begun to speak more clearly than any officer. Gravity, slope, and the visible advance of water translated hidden damage into bodily knowledge. A deck that had seemed level no longer felt so underfoot. Walking forward required greater attention. Objects shifted where before they had rested. Passengers no longer needed explanation alone. The ship's changed posture began instructing them directly. This phase of the sinking was defined by its terrible gradualness. Titanic did not throw her remaining passengers into immediate chaos. She asked them, minute by minute, to adjust to a world losing its balance. The bow dipped lower. The stern rose almost imperceptibly at first. Water claimed spaces that had recently belonged to ordinary movement. What had been architecture became topography. Staircases and corridors, designed for easy flow, now revealed themselves as channels through which human beings retreated from a rising boundary. There is something psychologically devastating about a large structure changing shape while still remaining recognizably itself. The lights were often still on, railings still gleamed. The ship could still be described by the same nouns: deck, staircase, bridge, rail, companionway. And yet, each familiar thing had acquired a new relationship to gravity and time. Familiarity remained just strong enough to hurt. People could see the world they knew, even as it was being taken away from them in plain sight. For those still aboard, options narrowed, not all at once, but by contour. One area became difficult, then impossible. Another seemed passable for a little while longer. The stern drew people aft for the simplest possible reason. It remained highest. Crowds gather where structure permits them to gather. No grand theory is needed. Human beings move toward the remaining ground. On Titanic, that ground itself was a receding privilege. Below decks, the change was harsher and more final. The laboring spaces that had powered the calm above were overtaken. Men withdrew upward when they could, leaving behind boilers, machinery, and compartments that had once represented control. One of the quieter symbolic reversals of the night is that the technological heart of the ship did not explode in theatrical failure. It was simply overwhelmed by the element it had long crossed. Water entered, power faltered, systems ceased, motion surrendered to settling. On deck, the growing angle affected emotion as much as movement. Disbelief became harder to maintain when standing itself required effort. This is where the emergency crossed from narrated fact into felt reality for many. The return to safe was still there in fragments, a voice of command, a railing to grip, a patch of deck still dry, a light still glowing overhead. But those fragments no longer assembled into the old confidence. They only postponed complete surrender. As the stern lifted higher, the ship's immense length became newly visible in a terrible way. What had been a horizontal world of routines and rooms was being turned toward the vertical. Time, too, seemed to alter. Minutes stretched, because so much remained visible, then compressed, because so much changed within each one. Titanic was no longer merely sinking. She was being transformed from a place one inhabited into a structure one clung to. Once that transformation began in earnest, no procedure could reverse it. Human decisions still mattered, but physics had become the stronger author of events. When the ship at last vanished beneath the surface, the story did not conclude so much as fracture into many smaller struggles spread across the water. For those who entered the sea, the shock was immediate and almost beyond language. Cold at that temperature is not simply discomfort, it is seizure. Interruption, command. The body loses its old conversation with itself. Breath rebels. Muscles tighten into uselessness. Thought, if it comes at all, comes through the assault of sensation. The Atlantic did not merely surround these people, it began taking over them at once. That reality is important because it strips away some of the sentimental misunderstandings that gather around maritime tragedy. Survival in such water was not mainly a question of courage. Courage could help a person resist panic for a moment, hold on to something, or continue trying. But physiology ruled. The cold narrowed human possibility with brutal speed. Those who found bits of wreckage or floating objects gained inches, not rescue. Those inches mattered, yet they could not transform the sea into safety. The voices carried across the water in the aftermath had become one of the most unbearable parts of Titanic's memory. Calls for help, cries, the overlapping evidence of lives not yet gone, but already slipping. In the stillness of the night, sound traveled clearly. Those in the boats heard more than they could answer, and inside the boats, another moral landscape emerged. Freezing air, overcrowding in some cases, dangerous emptiness in others, officers or seamen trying to maintain order, and the terrible knowledge that to row back toward swimmers might save a few while risking many if panic overturned a boat. This does not erase the pain of those choices. It only helps explain why they felt so impossible in the moment. The lifeboats themselves offered a thin, exposed form of survival, open to the air, vulnerable to spray, and occupied by people who often had inadequate clothing for hours on cold water. They were not scenes of triumph. They were waiting rooms between catastrophe and dawn. People huddled where they could. Hands went numb. Feet ached. Breath smoked faintly in the dark. Leadership mattered. In some boats, clear direction kept movement purposeful. In others, silence or confusion settled heavily, yet all of them were bound by the same fact. They were now small islands of temporary endurance, in a sea still littered with human consequence. As minutes passed, the cries diminished. This may be the single coldest transition in the entire story. Noise ebbs, not because peace has returned, but because strength has gone. Silence after suffering is not always relief. Sometimes it is simply the shape death leaves behind. Those in the boats had to live inside that silence while continuing to float. The ocean, calm all night, offered no wave-driven drama to distract the eye. It held everything still enough to be seen, if one wished to see it. And yet, even here, the return to safe appeared in frail forms. A blanket shared, a hand gripping the gunwale, an oar placed in a certain position, a voice telling others to conserve strength, someone looking toward the horizon rather than back toward the vanished ship. Human beings create islands of order whenever they can. In the lifeboats, those islands were small and shivering, but they were real. They kept some minds from splintering. They gave the hours until dawn a shape. When dawn finally began to soften blackness, it did not first bring joy. It brought visibility. The sea revealed debris, boats, and bodies with an impartial clarity that night had withheld. Survivors could see more, and seeing more meant understanding more. The scale of the loss no longer had to be imagined from sound alone. It could be counted in absence and in stillness. Mourning, so often associated with relief, arrived here as both mercy and revelation. The first sign that the long night might truly end came as light rather than rescue in human form. A paling line along the horizon separated sea from sky. Shapes emerged where darkness had previously hidden everything beyond a few yards. Lifeboats that had seemed isolated now belonged to a wider field. The wreck itself was gone. In its place lay a zone of aftermath, debris, still water, and the exhausted remnants of those who had escaped before the final plunge. When Carpathia's presence became visible, it did not instantly produce celebration. Many survivors were too cold, too drained, or too stunned for exuberance. Rescue, after such a night, can feel unreal until it arrives close enough to cast scale against the eye. Carpathia approached carefully, slowed by ice, by caution, by the need not to turn salvation into another accident. Her crew had prepared through the night with blankets, hot drinks, medical supplies, and the practical readiness that real compassion so often requires. The transfer from lifeboat to rescue ship was not merely a movement upward. It was a change in reality. Hands reached down, ropes were managed, bodies, stiff with cold and fatigue, were helped one by one onto a deck that felt impossibly stable. Blankets wrapped shoulders, warm liquids touched numb hands, orders were spoken in working tones. The very ordinariness of such care can be overwhelming after exposure. A person who has spent hours in uncertainty may be moved most not by grand speeches, but by being guided carefully across a threshold and treated as someone expected to live. Carpathia herself became a floating aftermath, a ship carrying not a cheerful passenger list, but a shocked and incomplete society. Survivors searched faces, names were spoken softly. The logic of class dissolved before the more immediate logic of missing and found. Some Titanic crew, even after rescue, continued helping out of habit. Duties do not vanish from the body simply because the structure that once assigned them has sunk. People made space for strangers. Lounges became resting rooms. Warmth and quiet became forms of mercy. The rescue also confirmed the cruel arithmetic of the night. Very few would be taken from the water beyond those already in boats. Carpathia searched as prudence and time allowed, but the sea had made its decisions hours earlier. That fact lay over the rescue like a second weather. Relief and grief were not separate phases. They arrived braided together. To be alive was to begin noticing who was not. As Carpathia turned toward New York, the atmosphere aboard remained subdued. The crisis of immediate survival had ended, but a new kind of endurance had begun. The body might be safe now, yet the mind was still catching up. There would be hot drinks, blankets, bunks, questions, names, and eventually headline. For the moment, however, the ship simply moved forward under morning light, carrying a diminished human world away from a patch of ocean that looked, from a distance, almost as calm as if nothing at all had happened there. Once survivors were on Carpathia and the ship turned toward land, the disaster entered another domain entirely. The domain of explanation. Catastrophe at sea does not remain at sea for long. Wireless messages, imperfect and sometimes contradictory, reached shore ahead of the survivors themselves. Early reports produced confusion. Some accounts suggested a damaged but surviving vessel. Others hinted at something much worse. The modern world could distribute news rapidly, but rapid distribution did not guarantee accuracy. In that first haze of information, the public knew enough to be alarmed, and too little to be certain. By the time Carpathia neared New York, uncertainty had hardened into collective shock. Titanic was gone. Crowds gathered not in a mood of triumph, but in a posture of waiting. Families searched lists. Reporters sharpened questions. Officials anticipated testimony. The ship's arrival would not simply deliver survivors. It would release a flood of fragmented memory into a society desperate to convert grief into narrative. Human beings can bear loss more easily when told why it happened, even if the why is incomplete. The inquiries that followed in the United States and Britain reflected this need, but they approached it with different temperaments. One leaned more openly into urgency and public scrutiny. The other moved with a slower, more formal style, yet both confronted the same difficult truth. Titanic had not been lost through one absurd act detached from context. She had been lost through an accumulation of plausible decisions. Accepted standards, design assumptions, environmental conditions, and human judgments that interacted fatally. Questions formed themselves around speed, ice messages, lifeboats, training, wireless practice, and the nearby Californian. Why had the ship maintained her pace? Why had warnings not produced greater alteration? Why were there not enough boats for all? Why were some launched with empty places? Why had rockets gone uninterpreted by others? These are natural questions, but their answers resisted satisfying simplicity. Every witness remembered from a different location in the ship's moral and physical geography. Stress bent memory, perspective narrowed understanding. Timelines wavered, public blame, meanwhile, searched for faces. That too is an old habit. A disaster of this magnitude attracts not only sorrow but narrative appetite. Newspapers elevated heroes, questioned cowards, pursued sensational contrasts, and turned complex institutional failures into personal drama whenever possible. Some individuals became symbols far larger than their actual slice of the event. Others, whose labor had mattered profoundly, remained almost anonymous. History is never entirely fair in the way it distributes attention. Yet, the inquiries accomplished something valuable despite these distortions. They slowed the night down. They transformed shock into records, questions, procedures, and recommendations. They forced maritime culture to look at what had seemed ordinary before, and ask whether ordinary practice had grown too confident. In that sense, the move from ocean to courtroom or hearing chamber was another return to safety of a certain kind. Not emotional safety, but institutional safety. The attempt to make understanding itself a barrier against repetition. It could not restore the dead. It could, perhaps, teach the living what kind of confidence needed to change. The most enduring practical legacy of Titanic was not a monument or a phrase. It was revision of rules, revision of assumptions, revision of what the maritime world could plausibly treat as acceptable. Before the sinking, many practices appeared sensible because they had not yet failed in quite that way. After the sinking, the same practices looked inadequate, sometimes painfully so. This is one of history's harshest methods of education. A system may obey the logic of its own era right up until an event exposes how incomplete that logic has been. Lifeboat regulations changed. The old habit of calculating required boats by tonnage, rather than by total persons aboard, could no longer survive public and professional scrutiny. Capacity had to match possibility, not just precedent. Continuous wireless watch became another central reform. The notion that a distress call might go unheard because an operator was off duty belonged to a world now judged too casual about communication. If the sea was to remain dangerous, then at least the channels across it had to remain awake. Ice itself, though ancient and indifferent, became subject to more systematic human attention. Patrols and coordinated reporting emerged to reduce reliance on scattered observations and individual interpretation. This did not make the Atlantic gentle. Nothing could do that. But it acknowledged that knowledge had to be shared more deliberately if ships were to move confidently through waters shaped by seasonal danger. Confidence, after Titanic, could no longer be allowed to mean merely continuing as before. Design thinking shifted as well. Engineers and naval architects looked again at compartmentalization, bulkheads, and the behavior of large vessels under compound stress. Titanic had shown that resilience against one expected kind of damage did not guarantee resilience against several interacting failures. This lesson spread far beyond shipping in the decades to come. Systems had to be judged not only by how they functioned in ideal or ordinary conditions, but by how they might fail when assumptions piled on one another. What changed, in the broadest sense, was the relationship between progress and humility. The sea remained the same ancient medium. Ships would continue growing. Routes would remain busy. Technology would improve. But after Titanic, improvement could no longer be narrated as simple triumph. It had to include the memory of what large, well-built, well-staffed, reputable systems might still overlook. A new seriousness entered the conversation. Not anti-modern, not fatalistic, but chastened. This is why the story endures so strongly in the history of safety. Titanic did not make the ocean harmless. That would be impossible. Instead, she helped force a shift from confidence based mainly on habit to confidence disciplined by contingency. The world after her loss still crossed the Atlantic, still trusted engineering, still prized efficiency and comfort. Yet those values were increasingly paired with a deeper respect for what procedures must assume at the margins. In this way, the sea changed not physically, but institutionally. Human beings approached it differently because one night had made old reassurance sound too incomplete. Even after rules changed and inquiries concluded, Titanic did not settle quietly into the category of a closed event. She became something more durable and less tidy, a memory structure. Generations returned to her not only because so many lives were lost, but because the shape of the loss seemed to illuminate larger human questions. Why do societies trust systems so deeply just before those systems meet their limits? Why does comfort lull judgment so effectively? Why do we find it easier to imagine danger dramatically than gradually? Part of Titanic's afterlife lies in the peculiar contrast at her center. The ship represented modern confidence, but the disaster unfolded with ancient elements: cold water, darkness, distance, human hesitation, and the brutal arithmetic of exposure. She sat at a threshold between worlds, too modern to be dismissed as a primitive failure, too vulnerable to sustain the illusion that technical sophistication could banish catastrophe. She became an emblem not simply of tragedy, but of overreach moderated by memory. There is also the human scale of the story, which keeps it from becoming only an abstract lesson. Grand staircase and boiler room, officer and child, wealthy suite and crowded third-class cabin, a band playing while boats descend, a husband stepping back from a boat, a steward knocking softly on a door, a wireless operator tapping into the night. These are not details people forget easily, because they transform history from statistic into texture. The voyage remains thinkable through them, and yet Titanic endures not only because of dramatic images, but because of the mood that surrounds them. The long beginning of calm, the way the ship encouraged people to settle, the fact that the end came to a world still lit and inhabited. The mind returns to such a structure almost involuntarily, because it resembles many other human situations. Confidence grows through routine. Warnings arrive in fragments. Action lags behind knowledge. Meaning is assigned only after consequence. Titanic is maritime history. Yes, but it is also a general human pattern floating in steel. Form. What? For survivors, memory would never have been so philosophical. It remained personal, bodily, unfinished. Some spoke when asked, some preferred silence, some found that the night returned in sounds, in darkness, in water, in anniversaries, in the simple fact of being the person who lived when others did not. Public memory can turn disaster into symbol. Private memory often resists such neatness. It keeps hold of sensations, voices, and absences. This tension is part of why Titanic still mattered. She is both case study and elegy. She warns without becoming a sermon. She reveals the need for humility without requiring us to reject progress altogether. The deepest lesson is not that human beings should abandon ambition, but that ambition, without imaginative caution, eventually mistakes smooth function for full safety. Titanic continues drifting through culture because she tells that truth in a form almost impossible to ignore. A magnificent moving world, brought to grief not by madness, but by the quiet limits of confidence. And now, after all the movement of that voyage, after the polished rooms and the cold watch, after the scrape in the dark and the long waiting for dawn, the ocean can return to its own older character, wide, cold, quiet, indifferent in the way only nature can be. The same water that carried lifeboats toward rescue closed without ceremony over the ship herself. By morning, the surface offered no grand memorial, only scattered evidence and a horizon already preparing to look ordinary again. For those who survived, ordinary life would return only by degrees. Memory does not obey the calendar with much discipline. It lingers in strange ways, in nights too quiet, in sudden sounds, in cold air, in the names of ships, in the private knowledge that one crossed a boundary, others did not. Yet, life continues, and perhaps that continuation is part of the story too. Not closure, exactly, because some events do not close. More carrying forward with altered understanding. For the wider world, Titanic remained as a kind of low, steady warning. Not a shouted moral, but a quieter one. Progress is real, but never complete. Systems deserve trust, but never worship. Calm can be earned and still be misleading. And attention matters most, sometimes, when nothing outwardly seems wrong. These are not lessons that seal themselves neatly at the end of a tale. They remain open, as the sea remains open, asking to be remembered without pretending that memory alone can remove danger from the world. So there is no need to close this night with a hard lid. The ship is gone, but the meaning of the voyage does not end in one final sentence. It drifts outward into the ways people travel, design, judge, and reassure themselves. It lives in regulations, in history, in stories told softly after midnight, and in the simple fact that human beings continue crossing uncertain spaces while hoping the structures around them will hold. The lights aboard Titanic are out now. The voices have faded. The waiting has passed into memory. Only the water remains, dark and patient, beneath a sky that does not hurry for anyone. And if the story leaves behind a final feeling, perhaps it is not terror, but quiet attention. The sense of listening more carefully to calm, because calm itself can conceal so much. Let the ocean lie there now. Let it be, wide enough to hold both what was lost and what was learned. Let the night settle without forcing it closed.